Right, yep. Hello. Wonderful. Good evening, afternoon. Good afternoon. God, when you're in with all these, this lighting, I keep making this mistake. It is still the afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This is Conservative Home in partnership with the Community Security Trust, and we are here for a debate on anti-Semitism. It's an ugly crime. It's never gone away, but it is unfortunately over the last few years it has risen to prominence in a way that it hasn't in some time. Obviously there was the Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, which is now happily ended, but I think it's quite clear that that party still has problems. But it's by no means confined to the opposition. According to the Community Security Trust, their report of anti-Semitic incidents has hit the highest annual total since they started doing it in 1984. This is clearly something that the government needs to get on the front foot for addressing, and today our panel is going to discuss how to do that. Joining me is Robert Jenrick MP, Dave Rich, the Director of Policy for the CST, and Danny Stone, Chief Executive of the Antisemitism Policy Trust. I'm sure you're all familiar with the format. Each of our panellists will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we will throw the floor open to questions. And now, without further ado, because no one's here for the chair, Robert.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Henry, for organising this, and to Con Home for doing this important debate today. I think the first time that you've chosen to tackle this issue at conference, and I'm very grateful for you for doing that. This is an issue that's always been personal to me. I'm the husband of a Jewish woman and the father of Jewish children. I've been on the receiving end of anti-Semitism myself during my time in politics. If I were to tweet about this event today, no doubt the comments that would follow would be absolute rank anti-Semitism of the worst kind. And so I understand what this is like, and I think it's incredibly important that we, the Conservative Party, are at the forefront of tackling it. Many people, I think, mistakenly felt that the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn in the general election was somehow the end of the struggle, and that we would move into a period in which anti-Semitism would recede or be less prominent in public life. Perhaps that's happened to some extent, but not nearly as much as those optimists might have imagined. As Henry said, anti-Semitism is the oldest form of anti-Semitism, and it's a cancer that is as interwoven within our country and society today as it's ever been. And you only have to look at some of the incidents that we've seen in recent months to appreciate that. Those scenes of vehicles driving down the Finchley Road in London back in May were absolutely shocking, I think, to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people across the country. They showed that, unfortunately, anti-Semitism and extremism is alive and kicking in society, and should give us all more cause to fight this. The ways in which I've tried to do that have been on a number of different levels. The first thing is to root out anti-Semitism from the public sector and in institutions across this country, where unfortunately it has gained roots and has been given a free pass at times. To think, for example, that until a couple of days ago, there was a professor at Bristol University, one of this country's most reputable institutions, who was spreading conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism on campus to the very students that he's supposed to be protecting, and that the university, who knew this, took months and months to come to the conclusion that this man has no place on a university campus in this country. I wrote him to the university as Secretary of State repeatedly, and they often didn't even reply, or they would take weeks or months to send a fob-off response. Now they have acted, but that shows that we have to have concerted action in our universities, in councils, in schools and charities across the country. We've tried to do this as a government by being the first country in the world to uphold the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and to say, if you want to take public money as a university or as a council, then you must sign up to that, and you must apply it in action as well. And we're making some progress there, but there's clearly more that we need to do that. Secondly, when there are incidents of anti-Semitism, like that appalling scene in North London, then the police need to take action against those crimes immediately. They did, and those individuals have been charged, and we await what will ultimately happen to them. But I do wonder whether the police would have taken such swift action if it wasn't for people on social media government ministers, the Home Secretary, calling them to get on the streets, to get in the helicopter and to find those individuals and to take action against them. So we need the most robust approach possible from the police and law enforcement in this country to take action against them. Thirdly, we've got to view this as an education problem. We've got to get into schools to educate the next generation and to show them what a pluralistic society looks like and ensure that they don't buy into these extremist narratives that some young people unfortunately are, that breeds anti-Semitism. And we do that in a number of ways through brilliant organisations like the Holocaust Education Trust, the Anne Frank Trust, for example, through the new Holocaust Memorial that I'm very proud that we're going to be building next to the Palace of Westminster, and spades will be in the ground, I hope, in the coming weeks on that project. Fourthly, I think we tackle this by addressing the issues online, and that has become the new frontier of anti-Semitism. As I say, I've experienced it, many of you in this room will have done as well if you either are Jewish or have taken action and made pronouncements on social media on this issue. I hope that the forthcoming bill that will be going through Parliament will help us to take action, but there's clearly more that the social media companies need to do to root this out wherever they find it. And I think many young people in this country do not really even know what anti-Semitism looks like. And you saw, for example, during the Gazan conflict just a few months ago, how many otherwise perfectly normal young people were retweeting, were liking memes which were deeply offensive and anti-Semitic to our Jewish friends and neighbours. And so we have to be better calling that out, educating the next generation, explaining what anti-Semitism actually looks like. And then the last thing, which is a broader point than just anti-Semitism, it's all forms of extremism, is that we have to be better as a country at ensuring that the victims of extremism are properly supported. I think it's astonishing today that there is, for example, still a teacher from a school in Batley who is in hiding, fearful for his life, who is receiving police protection and support for doing his job. Sarah Khan, who I appointed to be our advisor on extremism, is now going to be helping to ensure that schools and charities and local authorities understand their responsibility to tackle extremism more generally and to support the victims of extremism, so that we don't live in a country where individuals like that have to live in fear for their life without any support from the state when they find themselves in that situation. So I think there's a huge challenge still ahead of us. I'm proud of the record that the Conservative Party has had, but we shouldn't rest on our laurels at all, because anti-Semitism is still with us, and we must be the party that is out there at the forefront tackling it and supporting those people and organisations like the Community Security Trust, who I'm very pleased to be with today, and the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust as well, who are at the forefront of tackling this issue and ensuring that we support Jewish people in this country so they feel safe and secure and welcome at all times.
Thank you. Dave.
Thank you. Thank you to Conservative Home, to all of you for coming, and thank you to Robert for all the support you've given to CST over the years. It's been much appreciated and incredibly helpful, and sadly very necessary. The massive increase in anti-Semitism that we saw in May of this year during the conflict in Gaza in some ways took a lot of people by surprise, but in other ways really shouldn't have done, because it is something that we have seen so many times over the years. And it's the reason why when we talk about this kind of anti-Semitism, we have to bracket it with our discussion of extremism. Because what we saw was a massive increase in hate crimes against Jewish people, such as the convoy, which got global attention. But literally every other day, there were reports to us of cars and people going through Jewish neighbourhoods up and down the country, waving flags, shouting abuse at visibly Jewish people on the street. I mean, literally on the one day we had reports from Glasgow and Bournemouth. It was that spread out across the whole of the UK. And what we saw repeatedly were extremists, people from an extremist ideology or extremist movements exploiting what was happening in Israel and Gaza to sow division and anger and suspicion between communities here in this country. We saw it in Golders Green, where we saw 3 Islamist YouTubers with a combined following online of well over 1 million people who took a van with a massive screen into Golders Green Road on a Saturday afternoon as people are walking to and from synagogue on the Sabbath, and flashed up pictures, not just from Gaza, but pictures from the Holocaust, and then stopped visibly Jewish, Orthodox Jewish people on the street, shoved a camera in their face, and started interrogating them about what they thought about what was happening in Israel. And when they clipped this into a 15-minute highlights reel and put it on YouTube, what they called it was Muslims Confront Radical Israelis, right? Now, none of the people they stopped were Israeli, right? They were British Jews. But by pitching this as Muslims versus Israelis, they frame it in a way that instantly divides communities in this country and puts them against each other. And we saw this repeatedly during this conflict. Now, that isn't the only kind of extremism where we see this. And one thing that really ties anti-Semitism to extremism is that we see it in every type. Right? We've seen it in the past few years in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, where we saw these hard left extremist ideas coming into mainstream politics through that avenue. And thankfully, that period is over and things are getting back to something approaching normal in that party now. But we also see it on the far right as well, with this really worrying growth in the involvement of young people in neo-Nazi terrorism and violent extremism. Part of CST's work all the time is we are researching and monitoring what is going on with in different extremist networks, especially online, and who is it who might be moving towards an attack on the community and who needs reporting to the police. And we are seeing, over the last few years, we have seen an increasing amount of explicit violent anti-Semitism in these online far-right networks, and specifically focused on teenagers, on young people as a target audience and as the people who they're trying to drag into this. And also we're seeing it on the jihadist side as well. And one thing that happened during the conflict in May that was definitely new was a massive surge in complaints about not just anti-Semitism, but the really damaging impact on Jewish teenagers of anti-Israel activism in schools. And schools became kind of a battleground in May for this kind of political campaigning that in itself and in the language it used may not have been explicitly anti-Semitic, but the impact it had on Jewish kids in mainstream schools and on Jewish teachers who were singled out by students, by pupils for abuse, was really, really worrying. And I think it was another reminder that when we look at where is it that we really need to focus our efforts in tackling extremism, tackling anti-Semitism, that age cohort, both in schools and online, is an absolutely essential part of the work that we need to put in place. And the reason for this, and what so much of this comes back to, is social media and the role played by social media and by online platforms in spreading ideas. And the best example of this I can give is what's happened during the pandemic, what's happened with the kind of anti-vax movement and the anti-lockdown movements and so on. There's a group called Keep Talking that CST, working with Hope Not Hate, exposed. We kind of monitored and researched and exposed just a couple of months before the pandemic hit, actually. And this was a group of conspiracy theorists who would meet in London once a month in a room above a pub, and they would talk about their various ideas to each other. And you would get neo-Nazis, Holocaust deniers, people who'd been thrown out of the Labour Party who considered themselves left-wing, and you'd get just kind of generic conspiracy theorists. I mean, Piers Corbyn would turn up, and various people who, you know, defenders of Assad in Syria and all sorts, alongside someone giving a speech about why, you know, Paul McCartney died before Sgt. Pepper and it's all that kind of stuff. Now, this was, they were worrying and their ideas were horrible, but they were basically a bunch of cranks meeting in a room above a pub. COVID hits, right? The pandemic spreads, and before you know it, these people are speaking to crowds of thousands in Trafalgar Square. And no one's saying these people shouldn't be in this movement because they're Holocaust deniers. They're welcome, right? And loads of ordinary people who have not been exposed to these conspiracy theories and this anti-Semitism before are suddenly pulled into this movement. And you have a movement just driven by conspiracy theories. And whenever conspiracy theories are driving an ideology or a movement, anti-Semitism is always in there. somewhere. And this combination of conspiracism, social media, and the appeal to youth, I think, is really where we need to be focusing our efforts from now on.
Thank you very much. Danny.
Thank you. I should say I'm not Hannah Stewart. I'm her balder, uglier, hopefully as well-informed replacement. I am Danny Stone. I'm the Chief Executive of the Antisemitism Policy Trust. And it's also, I feel like it's important when talking about anti-Semitism to just have a word that, you know, Jews are doing great in Britain. It is a wonderful country to live in. You know, there are laws that protect Jewish people here. And, you know, the Jewish Leadership Council are in the room. You know, the Jewish Leadership Council and others are doing really great things and the Board of Deputies doing great things for Jewish people, right? At the same time, you know, we look around the world and we know that there are attacks on Jews. In the US, I think it was 57.5% of the hate crimes that were reported by the FBI were against Jewish people. It was anti-Semitism, right, for a community of, what, it makes up 2% of the USA, less. Similarly, in France, the number of hate crimes against Jewish people have been fleeing France. And in Britain, as David said, anti-Semitic incidents between May and June, just to take one example, rose by 365%, was it? You know, we are living in very uncertain times. And those uncertain times, Barry Weiss, the journalist, called it a great unraveling of the post-war liberal order. Right? We've got a growth in populism. We've got a growth in suspicion. We've got economic uncertainty. Right? That is prime territory for conspiracy. That is prime territory for people to feel uncertain about their place in the world and to look for some way of understanding it, someone to blame, and some way of trying to make sense of things. You know, the truth is no longer necessarily the truth. A lie is not a lie. Those things play into our public discourse, and despite its flaws, that order in the world, I think, was a healthy thing for Jewish people. What we now have is a series of new narratives. There is an erasive anti-Semitism. Jews no longer figure in certain spaces. So Jews are either considered too white. Jews are considered to have a special privilege, right? Either white privilege or even indeed Jewish privilege, so that they are not part of the community that can experience racism. This is a narrative that some would present, right? Similarly, Jews are not white on the far right. We will hear Jews are kind of translucent. Jews are responsible for upsetting some of the white supremacist ideals, right? So you've got these kind of dual conflicting narratives, and that's the thing. Anti-Semitism can fit different narratives, and it does fit different narratives. But then it meets, as Dave was saying, it meets conspiracy. It meets conspiracy. There is conspiracy in everything. And, you know, Dave, the CST and the Institute for Jewish Policy Research did some really interesting work. They polled 4,500 people about 4 years ago now. And they put a series of anti-Semitic statements to these people and saw how many agreed with a particular statement. And some mainly, and again, the good news, majority of people didn't agree with an anti-Semitic statement. They thought, you know, Jews are great, Jews are like me, Jews are like, you know, us. But there was up to 30% of people believed one of those anti-Semitic things to be true. Right now, you would consider somebody who believes the 7 or 8 anti-Semitic statements that were put to them to be a hardened anti-Semite. The 30% of people aren't anti-Semitic, but they believe an anti-Semitic thing to be true. If that is true, and if that's how we understand anti-Semitism, up to 30% of the population could believe an anti-Semitic thing to be true, well, what's happening when the conspiracies are then spread at a greater rate? What's happening when they're more prominent, when more people are comforted by them? What happens when there's greater reach, where instead of saying something anti-Semitic in a pub, you put it on Twitter, for example, and it stays there, and other people can find it, and young people can find it, right? You have a broader appeal, a broader reach for that anti-Semitism. And so, you know, there are things that can and should be done to address that. In public, we have an issue in public life of trying to ensure that MPs and others understand anti-Semitism. There are people who really understand it and who've taken action to address it, like Robert, right? and there are people who don't understand it. And we saw that certainly during the Corbyn leadership years, particularly amongst some MPs who not only didn't understand anti-Semitism, but would engage in anti-Semitic discourse. And that's not unique to those years, it's happened at other times. And part of my job is to try and educate those decision makers to ensure they do understand the words, the meaning that those words have, but also the responsibility for being on a public platform. And it's not just MPs, as I say, it's others in public life. But we also have to ensure that our legislation can address anti-Semitism. And there are a number of bills which have relevance. I'll just touch on these briefly before finishing up. The online safety bill is a big one. As Dave said, the online space needs regulating. At the moment, there is nothing there. And there is debate at this conference as to whether we should be regulating legal but harmful content or just illegal material. My position is very clear. We regulate legal but harmful content in other spaces. We do it when it comes to our videos, we do it, or films, we do it when it comes to our broadcast space. There's no reason whatsoever that we shouldn't be doing it in the online space, and I'm happy to take any questions on that. The higher education freedom of speech bill, I worry about some of the protections that will give to people who can engage in anti-Semitism, and we're working with government and opposition to try and ensure that bill recognises those legal harms and tries to ensure that it can protect people who are on campus, which, as Robert has pointed to, we have a problem with. Certainly when it came to Bristol, we had a real problem with. Even the elections bill, which addresses undue influence, there are those groups out there that have sought to affect elections by using their influence through engaging in anti-Semitism. Right? There's a whole host of ways through legislation that we can ensure that Jewish communal life and Jewish people can be safe and continue to enjoy life, which is what it's about. It's about a community, one of many, feeling engaged and able to celebrate and do all those great things that I talked about at the beginning, so that we can have fewer panels like this and more panels about what's happening in the Jewish world in Britain. So that's my starter for 10, and happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Right, we have about 35 minutes and a full room, so we're now going to go open to questions, so I will give the usual chair's plea for concision. That way we can hopefully get as many voices as possible. So we're going to start with the lady in the front row and the lady in the third row over there. Microphones are on their way.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes, it is. Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I just want to say, as a member of the Manchester Jewish community and also representing a council ward in Manchester, at least North Manchester, I wasn't particularly surprised at what happened in May. There was a protest marches taking place, which fortunately the police stopped. I also want to thank the CST very much. You have a lot of volunteers working for you who really do keep the Jewish community safe. But basically, I've heard from you that it is the rise of social media that has really sort of fanned the flames of anti-Semitism. So my actual question is, there is an online safety bill going through Parliament. Do you feel that it has got or will have enough teeth to actually be effective? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I am a member of the Jewish community. I live in London. It was a fairly unfortunate situation when my father, sitting in a bomb shelter in Tel Aviv, was telling me, Sonishka, please make sure that you do not go outside because there are men screaming rape Jewish women in Golders Green from a bomb shelter in Tel Aviv. He was more concerned about my safety in London, in the UK, than about his own in Tel Aviv. I think every member of this panel has mentioned education. And my question is how do we ensure that the Jewish community has sort of key stake in ensuring that that education is appropriate? Because I think that we often have people sort of who care but aren't aware enough about how to make that education relevant. Specifically, there's a lot of discussion about Jews being sort of too white, and therefore this entirety of the sort of Israel is a white state, when in reality Israel is a safe place for North African Jews kicked out of their countries. And there's a lot of history surrounding that isn't talked about sufficiently for people to understand sort of why we have these myths and why they're so harmful. So I'm very interested in how do we sort of make sure that our key stakeholders are actually being engaged in that conversation about how that education is given to young people. Thank you.
Okay, so if we start with Robert and work down, I think, and then that'll work.
Sure. Well, to your point, and thank you for the work that you've done as a councillor, there were very concerning scenes in Manchester, as you know, weren't there? And I remember seeing the social media footage of protests in the Trafford Centre, I think it was, wasn't it, where police did take action, actually, but I'm sure people were very concerned. On your point about the online safety, well, I think it remains to be seen, really, how effective that's going to be. There's clearly going to be considerable debate to come in Parliament, and there'll be a lot of scrutiny of the bill. It isn't yet clear to me how effective it will be at tackling these issues. I think it will help with some of the most extreme forms of anti-Semitism, but as Danny said, there's quite a lot before you get to that point, and that's where it's not so clear whether it will change it, and that's more about social and cultural attitudes in society more broadly, where you get young people retweeting, liking things which are not the most base form of anti-Semitism, but which are on the way to it, and which certainly, as Dave and Danny have said, make a lot of young Jewish people feel very uncomfortable, particularly when they're on this line about legitimate criticism of Israel versus something that's more nefarious and leaves Jewish people feeling unwelcome and concerned. And I think the bill is not necessarily going to tackle that. I also have concerns, which I think Danny alludes to, about the freedom of speech bill. I think that's a well-intentioned piece of legislation, but it's not clear to me how well designed it actually is, because I certainly don't want to see a Holocaust denier on a university campus citing a piece of legislation produced by this government. And I think we need to, well, I'm sure it will be subjected to a lot more scrutiny as it passes through its final stages in Parliament, but I think it needs to, so we don't make a misstep there that we would regret.
Firstly, thank you for your kind words about CST. Look, the online safety bill, it is a concern that it needs to have not just enough teeth, but it needs to have the correct powers, and it needs to have a regulator that understands the problem and is able to enforce it. Of course, anti-Semitism has been around a lot longer than social media, but nowadays, social media is what shapes how it works, how anti-Semites connect with each other, organise things, deploy their ideas, target the Jewish community. And it enables anti-Semitic activity in a way that would not happen were it not for social media, or would not happen in that way were it not for social media. And therefore it has to be controlled. And of course, it's not just about anti-Semitism. There are a whole myriad ways in which social media has negative impacts on society, and social media companies simply do not act in the way they should. So we need that regulation, we need it to have teeth. In terms of education, in terms of what you're saying about your father being worried about you, I think it's a really stark reminder, actually, that anti-Semitism is not just damaging for the Jewish community, but when those headlines go around the world, it's damaging for Britain and for the image of Britain around the whole world. And it's a reminder that, again, anti-Semitism is a threat to all of our values and to the whole of society. It's really, really important that education about racism and anti-racism follows an understanding of racism that has space for an understanding of anti-Semitism. There's a lot more interest and action now in educating about racism and awareness about racism over the last couple of years following the murder of George Floyd, which is absolutely correct and understandable, but it's very important that that well-intentioned shift is broad enough to incorporate education about anti-Semitism, while not being so diluted that it misses the specifics of all these different types of prejudice and bigotry. And I think that is certainly something we're working on, and I think others in the community are definitely working on to make sure that that happens.
The effectiveness of the online safety bill will depend on how closely government considers and adopts the amendments that I'm proposing, which I'll give you a few examples of how it could be better. So, for example, at present, there are a number of categories which companies are going to be put into, and those in category 1 are going to have to address legal but harmful content, and those in category 2 won't. Search engines are in category 2. So Google and Amazon Alexa and other search services are not going to have to address legal but harmful content. Yet, when I informed Microsoft that their search bar, which they are responsible for, prompted me to the search term Jews are bastards, that was a particular problem which I believe should be covered by the online safety bill, right? So I would like to see either that fixed, for example, search engines brought into category 1, or an overarching duty of care to address reasonably foreseeable harms. The second thing, there's no address for anonymity in the bill at the moment. Right? A lot of the abuse online comes from anonymous accounts. Now, whilst we have to ensure that there are protections in place for whistleblowers and victims of domestic abuse, it is not unreasonable, as in financial services, for us to expect that social media companies could be forced to reveal somebody's identity if that person has behaved in a criminal way, for example, right? So the revelation of their identity to a particular individual, say a police officer or a lawyer, given a sufficient burden of proof. And finally, you talk about effectiveness. At the moment, there are fines going to be introduced, which work for Facebook or Twitter, but those are the cost of doing business for the large companies. To my mind, there should be senior individual management liability, as we have in the financial sector, so that someone in extremis can be hauled to jail if their company has failed repeatedly to take the right action to apply a duty of care. On education, Lord Mann, I know, who's the government advisor on anti-Semitism, Robert was line managing in Tories, which is not easy.
Yeah, it's not. I don't think I managed Lord Mann at all.
No, he is certainly looking at this, at the broader picture of what does education look like. How does it fit? Holocaust education is on what's on the national curriculum. Where does anti-Semitism fit within that? So I know it's something that's being looked at.
Thank you. Hands up again, please. The lady in the second row and the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Armin. I was a teacher up till 2 weeks ago when I was forced to sort of resign. I was teaching at a faith school, and I had the issue of the whole school chanting "Death to Israel" first thing in the morning. And when I raised the issue with the head teacher, I was told that this is not a racist issue, and it's political, and I don't have any grounds. And if I don't like it, I can walk away. And that's what I did. I walked away. Thank you. Sadly, those boys who were driving down Golders Green, they were all born and brought up in this country. They were all British. How can we stop these people from living in this country and still having those kind of views? How can we stop these teachers having that much power over these kids to brainwash them? And when I did complain to Ofsted, I didn't have enough evidence. They said to me, well, we did visit the school, and they all look normal. Of course they look normal. They will never say it in front of you. But how can we have more power over these schools and the way these kids are being brought up, so we don't have to face them shouting rape Jewish women on the street? If it was the other way around, Parliament would be on fire. But just because they talked about Jewish people, nobody seems to really care. So how can we change the education system in a way that we could bring up children who would know what's right and what's not right, basically?
Thank you. Sir.
Good afternoon. My name's Christian Moore. I'm an Army officer. My question concerns why this is occurring and where it's occurring. So ideology always has a component in the radicalisation process, and it seems to me in the case of the rise of anti-Semitism, there is a left-wing pathway, but also a right-wing pathway. What's the percentage difference between the two, and how much is each ideology causing the growth? Second question was, where does Prevent fit in all of this, and how is Prevent pivoting to deal with anti-Semitism?
So if we start with Danny and come back the other way.
Well, firstly, I was sorry to hear of your experience. It cannot be easy to walk away from something like that. We do have a dearth of information and teacher training materials. This is something that we actually looked at. There was an all-party parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism, 2016, I think it reported, it was 2014-15. And one of the things that it looked at specifically was the teaching of the conflict. And were there enough materials out there? Was there even training on anti-Semitism? At the moment, there is little. UCL's Centre for Holocaust Education does some teacher training. It took the Secretary of State for Education to write to schools to point to a couple of organisations, but then there is a flip side to that, where those organisations then don't necessarily become trusted organisations if they're referred to by government. So we've got a job to do to produce some decent resources and to find organisations that can go in and start to challenge those processes. You would hope that any educational institution would be able to identify that chanting death to Israel isn't some kind of constructive dialogue about the Middle East, right? That there is a problem there that you would want to address, that should be an indicator of something. And perhaps we need to do more in calling that out, maybe, right? Trying to say, well, if we're going to make any progress here, we need something that deconstructs this better. But there is a gap there. As I say, I know of at least one initiative looking at that educative process and what the materials are that are out there. So I hope that gives some reassurance. On ideology, I mean, Dave will be able to speak to this better than I will, and thank you for your service as well. Certainly, we know that anti-Semitism doesn't come from one place. We know that there are the Islamists, the left and the right drivers. We know that at certain times, those different, certainly at least with the reports that come into CST, those different drivers have different levels of popularity, I suppose, or hold. But I think Dave's probably better positioned to talk about that than me.
Look, firstly, I'm really sorry what happened to you. And it's no consolation if I tell you you're not the only teacher who we heard very similar stories about during that period. And I think it is, the fact that this happens in schools is absolutely shocking. Some schools dealt with it well, other schools not so well. And I think what we saw and what you seem to have experienced is a lack of understanding and education at the level of the authorities who are supposed to be actually controlling and reacting to these problems. It's one thing to have a lack of education amongst the school kids. It's another for the people running the school or for Ofsted to just not really understand it and not really get it. And I think this speaks to a broader phenomenon that we definitely see a lot of, is just a lack of knowledge about anti-Semitism, full stop. We have fantastic Holocaust education in this country, which is absolutely vital. What I think we need to go along with that is education about other forms of anti-Semitism, actually, to fill in those gaps. And I think this kind of connects to your question, Sarah, actually, as well, in terms of anti-Semitism. It comes from lots of different ideological backgrounds. Now, Danny mentioned this big opinion polling that we at CST did a few years ago with the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. And in that poll, we asked people to place themselves on a political spectrum from very left-wing to very right-wing. And then we drilled down into each group to look at levels of anti-Semitism. What we found was people who described themselves as very right-wing were more anti-Semitic than people who describe themselves as very left-wing. But there are more people who are very left-wing in society than those who call themselves very right-wing. So the amount of anti-Semitism is actually evens out. But ultimately, the numbers at the fringes, at those extremes, are pretty small. And if you want to look at where do most anti-Semitic attitudes come from, and stereotypes and assumptions about Jews, it's just in the broad mass of society. And I think this is different from hostility towards Jewish people or malice towards Jewish people. But if we're talking about just negative stereotypes, anti-Semitic stereotypes, anti-Semitism has been around for centuries and has been in this country for centuries. And these ideas are very well embedded in broader culture, and at times of tension, they come forward and different people try and exploit them. And that can come from different directions depending on just what is going on at any given time.
well, no teacher should find themselves in the position that you did. Thank you for the brave way in which you've handled the situation, but you shouldn't have had to walk away from your job and your livelihood and your career. I hope you found a good next step and safe birth for yourself, but you shouldn't have been in that position. I think what it does speak to, as Dave has said, I think schools in particular, but public institutions more broadly, have a poor record on anti-Semitism and extremism, and we have to change that. In government, we have commissioned, I think, the beginning of a piece of work, which is to ask Sarah Khan to look at the terms of engagement and provide advice to all parts of the public sector, from central government departments. And when I was Secretary of State, we frequently battled against people who either deliberately or inadvertently would find themselves in conversations with groups that we don't support, like the Muslim Council of Britain or the Muslim Brotherhood, where we have explicit policies as a government that we don't engage with them, and provide that kind of good quality advice to all parts of the public sector, including to schools, and then provide advice to how they should react when problems arise. And it's not just anti-Semitism, it's extremism more broadly. We see whether it's the situation you found yourself in, or the school in Batley, or what happened in Birmingham. Schools and the local authorities that are there to support them, I think, invariably simply do not know how to handle those situations in a sensible and robust manner. And we've got to change that, so that if you were in that position again in the future, the school can handle it and can come in and make sure that you don't feel that you have to give up your career and move on, because you shouldn't have to.
Thank you. Show of hands again, please. We'll have Sunda and the gentleman in the third row there.
Thanks. Sunda Katwala from British Future. I'd like to thank all of the panel for all of the work and action you're doing to maintain vigilance and action on anti-Semitism. It's really important. Robert, I agree with you that Bristol was too slow on David Miller, but also that the Academic Freedom Bill needs looking at in the detail to make sure that he's not better protected in the future, because this is lawful racist speech that we don't want on campus. The government's promoting the anti-Semitic definition to make sure we came out. I wonder if you or the rest of the panel have an idea about how to get that boundary right. Is it something about the Equality Act? And does it apply to other protected characteristics as well, the lawful speech that we don't want on campus while we're trying to protect academic freedom?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and thank you to the panel, of course, for being here today to discuss these important issues. I take a question which is twofold, if that's okay, two slightly different points. The first is, what powers do you think the police have, or should have, going forwards to tackle anti-Semitism, and do they know how to use these powers in an effective way? And I say that because a small group of us actually attended a Palestinian Action protest a couple of months ago from Birmingham. In Birmingham, they decided to mount a building. You may have seen the articles about it. Strap themselves up there, and they obviously bring along a large contingent of people along with them on the ground to cheer them on. And there was some. I was there obviously with a small group who were opposing them, but there were police there. There was a large police presence, but there was some explicitly anti-Semitic things said at the time, and when I spoke to the police afterwards about sort of taking that forwards, they sort of fobbed me off by telling me it didn't quite cross the boundary, or wasn't quite within the definition, or however they said it. And I'm just, obviously it was in the definition, and I'm just not sure whether the police know what the boundary is between this is anti-Semitic and this is not. And I wondered what your comments were on that. The second point, as I say, is slightly different, if I may. As a recent graduate from university, I just wondered more broadly what you think should be done to tackle anti-Semitism on campus. Now, personally, I never experienced any, thankfully, but I know people who have. And I just think within the broad range of university campuses, there's so much that can go on, and that can go on behind the scenes with no one seeing it, that how would you it's a mammoth task, but how would you go about, or recommend going about, solving that problem? Thank you.
Robert.
Well, to answer your question, sir, I think there is a serious problem on campus, and you only have to speak to Jewish students and engage with organisations like the Union of Jewish Students to appreciate that. And you only have to follow the numbers as well. Universities that once had a strong Jewish community, to see how it's changed over the passage of years. Something has happened, and that's possibly the best way of viewing this, because people act with their feet and leave those universities, and that suggests that something's going badly wrong in those universities. I don't know what the answer is. What I do think is important is that those universities take very swift and robust action when there are clear instances of anti-Semitism. And that is where I really part company with Bristol University, because I could not believe that it would take them so long, and they would demonstrate a sort of indifference to the issue, to the point where I remember just a few months ago I wrote as Secretary of State to them, and they responded with, I wrote to the Vice-Chancellor, and he didn't respond. It came back from a sort of junior official within the university, as if this was a second or third tier issue, when actually it was cutting to the very reputation of the institution. So I responded and wrote to the Chancellor of the university, Sir Paul Nurse, who's a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and said, I think this is about time that you, as Chancellor of the university, stepped up and took some action. And as it happens, their processes did pan out, and Professor Miller is no longer at the university, but it showed a really worrying level, I think, of indifference to an issue of really central importance. I've also been concerned about how some universities just refuse to adopt the IRA definition, or have taken far too long to do so, and have repeatedly challenged those universities when they've not taken those issues seriously. So I think that's one role that government can play in really aggressively pushing those universities to take action where it's necessary, and doing everything we can to support organisations like the Union of Jewish Students, who I think are doing a fantastic job. And there's some very brave young people who shouldn't be having to worry about these things, because they should be having the best time of their lives. And by and large, most Jewish students are, but they should not be being put in that position. I think of students at Warwick University, for example, who I've had a lot of dealings with over the years, who were having to face some real difficulties with that university that just wasn't taking their complaints seriously. So government should be there supporting them, giving them all the help that they possibly can. To your point, and I do think that the freedom of speech bill is a well-intentioned but perhaps poorly constructed bill, and we need to give careful thought before it finally passes into law, because we would not want to be in a position, as I said, where a Holocaust denier is citing this piece of legislation passed by our own Parliament as the grounds on which they could be on campus making those remarks. And of course, we believe in free speech. That's one of the core tenets, isn't it, of us as Conservatives? And there's no right not to be offended. We should be having people on campus providing the most challenging opinions, and we'd never want people to be stopping that. But there has to be, I think, a line, and that bill needs to make clear what that line is, beyond which, when you're perpetuating clearly untrue, false opinions, like about the Holocaust, that you've really got no place in civilized society. And I hope we can make sure we get that bill right before it passes into law.
Dave?
I think when we're talking about campus, these two things come together. I think using the Equality Act as a guide is a very good idea. We found with the EHRC, which of course is the regulator for the Equality Act, the EHRC reporting to the Labour Party that they are, as a body, they are capable of producing a very well considered evidence but pretty robust investigation into anti-Semitism that actually ended up with a good result, and that I think the Jewish community have a lot of faith in them now, probably as a regulator. But I do agree with what Robert says, that as a bill it may be well intentioned, but there are certainly some wrinkles, I think, that need thinking through. The issue with campus, it's all very well to adopt the IHRA definition, But there is a problem with the processes that are in place for a lot of universities for how to make a complaint. If we look at the David Miller case, CST, we were first approached by 2 Jewish students who were on his course when he first gave his lecture complaining there was this vast Zionist conspiracy behind Islamophobia. Back in February or March 2019, I mean, that's how far back it went. These 2 students both gave us written statements about what they'd heard and how it had made them feel, but they insisted on complaining anonymously because they were worried, I think correctly, that if they complained in their own name, it would affect their grades and the way they were treated. We made the complaint on their behalf. Bristol refused to accept it. They refused to acknowledge that a third-party hate crime agency could represent complainants, even though that is a principle that is very well established across society. They refused to accept anonymous complaints full stop. Right? They said students can complain anonymously, they just have to give their names to the complaints officer. Literally. And from that point on, whenever anyone challenged Bristol, Bristol's official position in reply would be, we have never received any complaints from any students that were in his lecture. That's right. Which was a lie. Right? They just refused to accept them, but they had those complaints. At Warwick, we had the situation where a Jewish student who felt that his lecturer had made an anti-Semitic statement in a lecture, but again didn't want to make the complaint in his own name and asked the president of his Jewish society to make the complaint on his behalf, and that president of the Jewish society, also a student, but in a representative position, made that complaint, and the lecturer then took out a counter-complaint against him, against the president of the society, for having the temerity to complain. So as long as universities have processes that strongly deter Jewish students or any other students from complaining about racist remarks or anti-Semitic remarks, that problem will grow. So you have to look at the processes. And I think universities have to basically not be so insular and learn some lessons from how other institutions in society tackle these problems. In terms of policing, I think police have enough powers. Right? I think there are issues with how they use them sometimes. I think there are particular issues with when anti-Semitic comments, chants, placards are used on demonstrations, and the police on the ground, I think understandably, for public order reasons, don't want to go in and make a big scene, but don't necessarily capture the evidence either. And I think there is a balance between maintaining the public order of just getting everyone home safely from that demonstration with actually, if something anti-Semitic has been said or done, you've got to intervene. And that balance, I think, sometimes is lost and needs to be shifted a bit in those circumstances. We saw that on a lot of the demonstrations in May.
Danny?
Cinder, on your point, I mean, look, I can give you some things that I think should be without the kind of the bounds of kind of reasonable discussion on university. You know, Holocaust denial is one. The way in which Bristol, we saw students kind of, it was essentially incitement. In my view, it may not have been illegal, but it was close enough. There are things that I could point to that I think should be outside of those limits. But it is somewhat an iterative process in so much as, you know, the BBFC, the way in which it regulates our films, it regulates them in a different way now than it used to, right? So now people are more concerned about the way that a film makes them feel than necessarily some of the content, the language or what have you. So some of this will shift over time, and there are ways in which people are attacked. You know, it was Zoom bombing during the pandemic that change, and similarly language changes and its use changes. So I think partly we have to kind of keep a watching brief, and we have to have that engagement, which is why it's important that regulators, be it the OFS for the higher education bill or the Ofcom in the online safety bill, are well engaged with organisations like CST or ours. On policing, I think the same as Dave, essentially, although it's worth noting that our hate crime laws are under review by the Law Commission at the moment, and it's not lost on me that my addition to this panel made it a manual, but specifically the work on misogyny and anti-Semitism, misogyny around hate crime, and the intersection of people's identities and the way in which they are attacked in an intersectional way, particularly in kind of the thing I'm most familiar with, misogynist anti-Semitism. It is important that that's addressed, that there are proper powers to address it, and that there are proper sentence uplifts, for example, in respect of people being abused, not just as a Jew, but as a woman. And on campus, the we know that particularly it was a problem around hate speakers coming onto campus. You know, our engagement with UJS, what are the problems for Jewish students? Hate speakers coming onto campus. Well, there's a number of frameworks in place to address that. The Universities UK had guidance, NUS had guidance. The two parts that go with that, though, are, number one, Jewish students knowing that those frameworks exist, right? So there's a job there for UJS or the Jewish community to ensure their activists know what to do. But secondly, to try and instill some institutional knowledge and memory in universities so we don't have to keep on going and having the same conversations, right? It's all very well me saying, oh, there are these Manchester guidelines, you know, you don't have to stop a speaker, but you can get them to sign something before they speak, or have the event filmed, or have additional security. And then 10 years later, having the same conversation with Manchester University, like, you used to have some really good protocols in place, right? So creating institutional memory in general is really important. In terms of addressing harms in any, not just on campus, but in any environment.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to take one question. I must repeat the urge for brevity because, you know, best will in the world, we're going to have 4 sets of 60 seconds. The gentleman in the front row, please. Is it short?
It's a very short question. Outside of Ben & Jerry's, what ice cream would you recommend?
Okay. Danny?
Oh, God. That's a good question. I don't know. My son's favourite at the moment is mint ice cream. He likes mint ice cream, so he's not so bothered about the brand. So long as it's mint, he'll be happy. So any mint ice cream I'll go for.
I always like a kind of Cornish clotted cream type ice cream. I was a bit rich, but always tasty.
Robert, the tough question.
I wasn't expecting that question, actually, I have to say, at a discussion about antisemitism.
Nor was I.
Well, the worst thing that's happened to me recently in my constituency is that a couple of doors away from our house, an ice cream parlour has opened. And so my 3 daughters now head there every time we're home in the constituency. The last ice cream that they bought was, to my horror as a parent, was a Prosecco flavoured ice cream, which made me feel like a very bad parent.
Okay, well, on that unexpectedly sort of cheery and slightly decadent note, it falls to me the happy job of thanking all of you for coming, thanking everyone for tuning in as well, and just inviting you to join me in a show of thanks to our panel. I hope everyone's had a great conference and will enjoy the rest of it in the revels this evening. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.